Welcome to 20-0 Tactics with me, the Loremaster, and on today's episode we're going to take a look at the tactics for Defensive Armies, one of the videos in our 5-part series covering the main army list types. So I'm going to begin by taking a look at how we'll be structuring today's episode. Firstly, we're going to look at the general features of Defensive Armies, followed by a look at the strengths and weaknesses of this army type. After that, we'll take a look at the Warhammer factions that do Defensive Armies best, followed by tactical pointers for using a Defensive Army list in your games, before we finish up looking at a sample Defensive Army list to illustrate the principles we've discussed. So, what are the general features of a Defensive Army? Well, Defensive Armies are typified by the following. First and foremost, they will be packed with ranged damage. It shouldn't be a surprise after all. Many of you will know Defensive Armies by another name, the gun line. When we think about that ranged damage, it can come in the form of shooting or magic. Now, they'll also be packed full of support characters. Really good Defensive Armies usually include characters that help the army to perform better as a first point of call. They're usually low manoeuvrability. In fact, they're often quite static. In most successful builds, there will be one or, at a push, 2 combat threats as a countercharge element for when what's left of the enemy finally makes it to your battle line. And the final common feature of Defensive Armies is that there will be a strong focus on chaff units to help ensure that the ranged elements of your army aren't being charged too early in the game, or to take out enemy ranged threats that could be a problem, like artillery. So with that established, it's time for us to take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of Defensive Armies. Now, we're going to start with the strengths before moving on to the weaknesses. So here we go. First up is reach. The fact that Defensive Armies will generally be doing damage from turn 1 is a huge strength. They are populated in the main with ranged threats, and these can start killing enemies straight away. The second big strength of Defensive Armies is that they're easier to get the most out of. And what I mean by this is, as long as you can cut off the enemy charges with chaff, you'll find that it's relatively easy to get the list scoring victory points for you. It's nothing quite as satisfying as cannoning that Varghul from the other side of the table. The next strength we're going to look at is the spreading of your points. The points you spend on your army will likely be distributed over several mid-sized shooting units. This is fantastic for holding your points on the table, and even better, it means spells like Dwellers Below, Pit of Shades or Fiery Convocation are, less effective, as casting them doesn't take out a huge chunk of your army. It will probably be hitting a mid-sized, mid-points value threat. Now, our final strength of Defensive Armies is that they are great big game hunters. Defensive lists are normally very good at killing high-value lone targets like monsters, and this is because they're populated with high-damage spells or heavy hitters like artillery. This is really good, particularly in win-loss-draw events like Derby Deathmatch. Okay, so with the key strengths of Defensive Army lists established, it's time for us to take a look at the weaknesses of the build. And this is arguably even more important than what we've just looked at, because trying to avoid these is what we need to do as defensive generals. So, target priority. Getting this wrong is a death sentence for Defensive Armies. So you need to ensure that you identify the most immediate threats every turn and target them first and foremost. And if you get that wrong, it's going to be a huge weakness for you. Getting greedy. Our second weakness is, a similar vein to the previous one. Splitting your ranged or magic damage over multiple targets at once can often lead to a failure to kill any of them. This is an easy pitfall that you need to avoid. Chaff failure. Not having enough chaff or failing to get it in at the right moment is just as dangerous for Defensive Army lists. You need to ensure you block off enemy charges to give yourself the best chance to win games. The fragility of ranged units. Most shooting or magic units are lower toughness and are not blessed with the greatest of armor saving throws. So these forming a large chunk of your army list can be an issue, especially if they get charged. Packing tight. Most defensive armies will pack tight. This gives you the smallest frontage to be charged on and means that spells you have which bubble up will have the best effect, as they'll hit more of your units. It also, however, means that one successful charge can roll an entire battle line, or that one magical vortex can see off the lion's share of your force. And that brings us on to our final weakness for defensive armies, which is magical vortexes or templates in general. It relates directly to what I just said, and they just hurt a lot when you're tightly packed and they land in the middle of your stuff. Now, defensive army lists in general are easy to get a lot out of, but are often equally as easy to take out of commission if you get the tactics wrong. The weaknesses presented here are far more important for you to take away than the strengths, and countering them will be crucial to having a lot of success and frustrating your enemies. So let's move on to take a look at the factions that excel as defensive armies. Unsurprisingly, armies with better quality shooting units tend to do this type of build best. Tomb Kings, Dwarves and Chaos Dwarves are without a doubt the masters of the defensive army. Orcs and Goblins, the Empire, High Elves, Dark Elves, Ogre Kingdoms and Skaven can all perform really well in defensive armies too, but I think there are some other builds that can be better for those factions. Now, the following factions should realistically avoid defensive builds in any competitive setting, and that's Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen. They don't shoot. Well, they don't have enough magic alone to do it. Just no. Any faction I've not named specifically is very much at your own risk if you want to defensive army them. There's just better builds for the others. So I'm going to recap this as I've done in the other videos in this series on army list types. Your top choices for defensive armies are Tomb Kings, Dwarves and Chaos Dwarves. Orcs and Goblins, the Empire, High Elves, Dark Elves, Ogre Kingdoms and Skaven can also all do really good defensive armies, just not quite as well as those top three. And Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen should never be considered as a defensive army faction. So let's move on now to look at the tactical pointers for using defensive armies. And on to my customary tricky part of the video. We're going to look at the general tactics that you should be using whenever you set up your defensive army to do battle. Now, this won't be an exhaustive list, as each army and each opponent is always a little different, but the general tactics I cover here should always be in your mind, and you should find you can use the vast majority of them in every game with your defensive build. Bunker, castle, denied flank, whatever you want to call it, in general defensive armies like to deploy in this fashion. Now, there is a 20-0 tactics video on this, where in the same section you found this video, which is called Denied Flank, and you should watch it. It will really help you to understand how to best deploy your defensive armies. Now, when deploying, try to ensure you have good line of sight options for all of your ranged units. This includes creating fire lanes for artillery if you have it. And again, I've got another handy video for you to check out. That's the 20-0 tactics video on getting the most out of your artillery. In the same section you found this one. You can check that out and it will really help again with using defensive armies. Target analysis is the next general tactic you should be looking at. You need to identify the most immediate threat every turn and kill it first. Things that fire templates should always be high on this list, as you will likely be tightly packed. Don't get greedy. When I talked about being greedy as a big weakness of your army, it was so that I could tell you now not to do it. Pick a target, destroy it, move on. Don't spread your shooting out and risk not killing any of them. Always save dice to dispel magical vortexes if your enemy has them. It's just a must do. I'm sorry, it's a must do. If they have them and they're in a position where the vortex could do you meaningful damage, you need to make sure you hold on to dispel dice to try and stop it. Try to ensure that any countercharging unit is deployed on the exposed end of your battle line. So I'm making the assumption here that you'll deploy in that denied flank if you can, so against a board edge or against a large piece of impassable terrain, say. The other end of that line is where you need to keep your counter-charging unit, ideally. And this will help to keep the rest of your shooting units safe. Chaff at the end with the shooting, counter-charging unit at the opposite end. It's great stuff. So, we've established the general tactical pointers for using defensive armies, which means all that's left to do in today's video is take a look at a sample army list and have a look at how it works in the defensive army style. Now, today's list is a Tomb King's army that is featured on many of the videos on our channel, and is very similar to one that I used to come third at Reading Warfare back in 2015. All that time ago. And we're going to take a look at it and discuss how it fits into the general features of a defensive army and how it can deliver the tactics we've just discussed as well. So the army has 2 Lich High Priests. They're both level 4 wizards. One has the Law of Nakara and is the Hierophant, and that one has the Power Stone and the Talisman of Preservation. The other one is a level 4 on the Law of Light with a Dispel Scroll and the Obsidian Amulet. Now, we have 2 Lich Priest heroes. They're both level 1 wizards with no other equipment or upgrades, and they're both using the Law of Light. Moving into our core section now, we have 2 regiments of 24 skeleton archers with full command, and we have 4 regiments of 5 skeleton horse archers. Going into the special slot, we have 4 Morghast Harbingers, we have a Kemrian War Sphinx with Fiery Roar and Envenomed Sting, another Kemrian War Sphinx with the Fiery Roar, and then we're moving to rare. We've got a Casket of Souls, a Hierotitan, and a Screaming Skull Catapult. Whew, lots to take in, so let's begin by looking at the general features of a defensive army and how this list kind of fits to them, so how we illustrate those general features, if you will. I said that first and foremost, these armies will be packed with ranged damage, and it will be a mixture of shooting and magic, and I don't think you're going to find a finer example of that than this list. You have a Light Council to do the big banishment damage, and that also has access to 3 Shem's Burning Gazes for magic missile damage. In addition, the Hierotitan supports this magical output and onslaught further by adding D3 to all the casting attempts of those Nakaran wizards. Now that's whether they're on Laura Nakara or Laura Light, very strong. He also has a bound spell of Shem's Burning Gaze. So you have potential 5 magic missiles here, guys. The magical onslaught is further supported by the Casket of Souls, which has a bound spell that makes you take wounds against leadership tests on 3d6. It's all very good stuff. Check out the Tomb King deep dive to hear me talk really positively about it there. This is more ranged damage. And the ranged damage doesn't end in the magic phase. The shooting phase range damage of this army is off the chain. We have 48 archers, 20 skeleton horse archers firing, and a Screaming Skull Catapult. That is a huge volume, and crucially, a volume that is good at killing different things. The Screaming Skull Catapults can work really well on monsters, or against blocks too, to be fair. And the core blocks, the big chunks of archers, will just rain death on any sort of light to moderately armoured infantry that comes your way. Now, the synergy here is really strong again because the Law of Nakara allows you to double up the shots on those units as well, excluding the catapult, which means that you can potentially score, what we're talking about here, 136 shots in one turn from this army. Yeah, that's not too bad when we said packed full of ranged damage, is it? Now, I also said that they'll be packed full of support characters, and I think I've illustrated quite nicely, if by accident, that it clearly is packed full of support characters. And the support characters are supported by the Hierotitan and the Casket of Souls 3 power dice. I mean, it's this support on support on support. You'll love to see it. Now, it is fair to say that it also typifies our third common feature, which is it's not very manoeuvrable. That's why we've got 4 units of chaff, because that's really important to help us overcome the fact that it lacks manoeuvrability. And actually, our 5th common feature was a strong focus on chaff. And that's so that we can protect the back line from enemy threats that we can then hit with countercharging units, which was, of course, our final common feature for defensive armies. Now, this one has 3, but which is actually quite a lot if you think about what I said earlier, where it'd be 1 or 2, but it doesn't really operate as 3. The Morghast Harbingers will operate as 1, and the Kemrian War Sphinxes will operate in a pair as 1. And this is because the Sphinxes are good, and they're particularly good against high-strength enemies because they're really rocking toughness. But singly, they'll just get overwhelmed over time because they're only strength 5 and they don't have a huge number of attacks. When you pack in the Morghasts, you've got a really, really scary countercharge unit there, which also has hover, meaning they can charge over your units and fly. They're just really, really strong. So we're going to move on now to the second kind of part of our analysis, and we're going to take a look at those general tactical pointers I talked about earlier and how the list kind of fits into being able to deliver those. And the first one was to denied flank, or a castle or bunker, whatever you want to call it. And you can see quite clearly here that this army is not going to have any problems doing that. It's got those 4 skeletal horse archer units to chore up and redirect enemies away from the denied flank bunker, which is excellent. And if you've watched the denied flank video, you'll know I talked about placing the vanguard units and switching them in. Now, you can't do that with skeleton horse archers because they actually do scout. But that is a hugely helpful rule for them, because it means you can put your shooting units against the 12-inch marker or the sort of extremity of your deployment zone, and then put your chaff units in front of them, scouting in front. Something that's really strong about that as well with Tomb Kings is the arrows of the Asaph means that they always hit on 5s. So, always hit on unmodified ballistic skills. So them being in the way doesn't sort of apply any cover modifier or negativity there either. Now, I also talked about line of sight, and this is going to be really important. True line of sight really helps this army because of what I just said about the arrows of the Asaph. But you'll stack your blocks in front of each other and then place your chaff in front of that, which means that it all has pretty good line of sight. The Screaming Skull Catapult would like line of sight, but it can live without it, which is excellent. And as a result, this army doesn't have to worry too much about the fire lanes that I talk about in that tactical pointers section either. So, target analysis. This is a difficult one. The army list doesn't really help me do that well. But what you've got to look at is what, generally speaking, is going to cause me the biggest problem quickest, and then you need to pick on it hard. I would say this: if you think that your opponent's got something that won't be dealable with Morghasts or Sphinxes, that's probably going to be high on your priority list, unless it's very slow. Not getting greedy, which is something that you have to be really careful of in this army, actually, because the blocks of skeleton archers are very large, so you can, particularly if you get a bubble up righteous smiting off, and you can shoot the blocks with 48 shots per block, which is terrifying. You can start getting really kind of greedy and firing a big block at one thing, firing the big block at the other. So just don't do that. It's really hard to swallow, but it's better to waste 5 wounds or 6 wounds than it is to not kill 2 units. It's better to kill 1 and waste some wounds on that, in my opinion, and that's certainly where I've seen the most success. But what's really good about this list in that sense is that you can fire one big block of skeleton archers and then use all those skeleton horse archer units to try and finish the job, so that you can still fire the other block at something else if you want. That's really helpful with not getting greedy. Always saving your dispel dice from magical vortexes is the next general tactic, which again is a hard one for me to kind of build into the list, but what I will say is you'll notice I have invested in the dispel scroll, and I've also got the obsidian amulet here, and that's important because it gives me synergy with my talisman of preservation on my Hierophant, who I really need to not get killed. So I have thought about some things there to counter enemy magic as well. And it's really important. I wouldn't leave home without a dispel scroll and a defensive army, if I'm honest. And finally, you need to try to ensure any counter-charging units are deployed on the exposed end of your battle line to keep the rest of your shooting units safe. This is a no-brainer with this list. It's probably going to be your Sphinxes that you do that with. You've got 2. And your Morghasts can do that too if you want. Or, because they fly, you can put them behind or in front of your army, which is really nice. Particularly I like in some games to deploy them behind my 2 blocks of skeleton archers and then fly them over on turn 1 and stand them in front. That's a really horrible protective screen. And because I don't suffer the penalty to hit modifiers for shooting through them, I'm not too worried about doing that. Now, it is worth pointing out that I can't do that with dwarves, but I can use gyrocopters, for example, in a very similar way. So don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box like that as well. Whew. That was a lot of breakdown analysis, and I have tried to do it quite quickly for you guys. But, feel free to have a really good study of the list yourself and think about how you think it might work or why you think it's been so successful for me as a defensive army. So to summarise, defensive armies are reliable with fantastic reach to attack opponents as soon as the game begins. This is tempered, however, by the general vulnerability of shooting units and how static the armies generally are. But for those who can protect their back line, defensive lists will deliver plenty of Warhammer victories. Now that concludes today's episode of 20 Tactics. I hope it's given you some ideas for your next army list. As ever, feel free to get in touch through all of our social media platforms to let us know what you thought, and head back to the Knights of the Realm mustering ground where you can check out the rest of our exclusive content.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?